Hi everyone, my name is Paweł Sroka, as introduced, and what I want to show you during that webinar is something probably most wanted when you play with Excel, because nowadays we are overloaded with work, and if it's something that allows you to automate some stuff you do usually, so it's really helpful. So this is why maybe it's a good idea to start your story with Excel automation now, especially that it's rather a long way. But when I show you some tips how to use it, maybe you will feel encouraged to continue such a way, and maybe you come back, because yeah, that's a long way, but it's always a good time to start and to see how to do that. So we've got here what you see on the screen now. Maybe I shared my screen to show you, not to waste time. I'm switching to Excel application, so hope you can see now the screen. And now what you see, it's simple data on empty sheet. Now at that moment you could just copy some part of your data you've got in one of your documents, no matter what's that data. So here I've got the data composed of the columns having the dates, the information about the region. So it looks like it's a sales register. So let's imagine you've got so some columns about the categories like dates, like the information about the sales, maybe about the persons. Doesn't matter at that moment. So if you want to continue and follow the steps, just do a copy of any part of data you've got, and I will show you how to create the automation allowing you to just apply the filtering to your data, especially that applying filters to simple tables like that one here is really easy, and it takes just seconds to get it. But if your tables are big, let's say got 30 or 50 columns or even more, what nowadays it's quite often situation, so it will be not so easy, not so fast to go through them, especially that we should search for those columns and then choose the multiple choices there. So that's why maybe it's a good help when you could automate that stuff. So you just record some macros allowing you to keep those settings of the filter, and then you can rerun them just by one click. So that's the concept. It means that if it's possible to record some operations you do, why not to do that? And I want to show you how to record such a filtering operation easy way, and then maybe edit a little bit the content so that we can make it more flexible, working in different contexts. And finally, we will create some buttons to run these macros. So you just click the button, and all that stuff recorded will be automatically evaluated for you. So your table will be filtered. Of course, I will show you how to use such an automation based on the Autofilter example. But finally, you could then experiment with other tools of the Excel application. So it means you could record and then edit the content to automate another stuff you do in Excel. So that's the concept here. The introduction to Excel automation based on the Autofilter example. So at the very beginning, you should know that, yes, what I said about macro recorder here in Excel, that's one of these tools you've gotten access to. And this is really simple tool, like voice recorder you've got in your phones. You could use the macro recorder in Excel. And macro recorder, this is a tool recording all the steps you do in Excel. So no matter what you do, you click, you just scroll the sheet, and maybe you just write some content to these cells. So every single step could be recorded, and then of course replayed. The problem usually is that we know that everything changes in Excel, right? In our sheets, we've got different ranges. They are bigger, smaller, and this is why usually we have to edit the content of what was recorded because finally it's not fitting the given situation we've got at that moment. That's really the problem with macros. And I want to show you some tips about how to make it working more general. Maybe you will find it useful even when you then will experiment with other tools in Excel automation. So hope you've got time to prepare the copy of your data. Once again, as you see, that's completely new sheet. So it's called book 1. So still it's not saved. I've just opened new book. I just pasted some sample data there. So hope you've got same thing prepared. Of course, not the same data because it doesn't matter what's that. But finally, if you are ready, you could follow my steps, do the same, because it's quite easy to record macros. Of course, on the way, I will inform you about important places, about important decisions you should make during the way. And finally, we will go to edit the content of this recorded stuff. So let's get started. First of all, if you want to start recording macros in Excel, you should know where you will find a button allowing you to start recording. So you could have different places for that, not only one. And the first one, most general, is to go to the View tab. And on the right side, maybe just change the position of the, yeah. So the first place is the View tab. When you go there on the right, you will find the button Macros. It's split it into two different parts. We are interested in the bottom part at that moment because the bottom part allows you to see more content hidden under the button. And one of these positions there is a record macro position. So that's one of these places you could use in order to run the macro recorder. That's not convenient, right? Because you should go to View tab, then click the button and choose from the list. So that's why if you are going then to use it more often, it's not a good place for that. So I want to show you another place you could have it. It's called status bar. That's the bar you've got at the bottom of the application window. So the place where you will find, for example, the Zoom tab, and where you've got just below the list of tabs. Okay, that's the status bar. So where you've got below tabs, worksheet tabs, you will find the status bar. And when you click this bar, right mouse button, so you will see the list with the positions you could have and see on the status bar. So most of them are selected, but the one at that moment we need is the macro recording. So if you want to see the button on the status bar, you have to make it checked. So just click it to check, and finally you will see new element on the status bar. This will be the button looking like looks like a schema of the worksheet, plus in the left top part of this icon you will see the gray wheel. So that's the icon representing the macro recorder. And when you have it there, it will be easy for you to run the macro recorder because it's always visible, right? You don't have to go to the View tab, click the button macros, right? It's just the place you can see always, no matter what's the sheet you are in, no matter what's the book you are in, doesn't matter, right? You've got this button always accessible. So this is the reason it's good to have it here, to make it more comfortable way to run it. So now, if you want to start recording macros, you just click that button, and finally we'll open the window. At that moment, an Excel application is not recording. At that moment, you set some important elements here, like macro name. You could define it at the same time the shortcut for the macro if you want to run it with shortcut. Of course, it's not a must to have it, but if you like, you could. What you should remember, if you set the shortcut, the control button is always part of this shortcut, and you can't exclude the control button, and you should know if you use one of these shortcuts you've got already working in Excel, like for example, Control C or maybe Control V. So finally, you will override the existing one. So be careful if you want to assign the shortcut to your macro. So think about the shortcuts you are not using when working with Excel. Otherwise, you should remember you will run not the Excel tool like usually, but you will run your macro finally. So be careful. So now you have to decide where to store the macro, and that's the choice you have to make based on different situations. So first of all, you should know that options you've got here are personal macro workbook and this workbook. There's a new workbook as well, but it's nothing special. A new book will be created automatically, and there the macro will be recorded. But of course, the two choices you've got here, like personal macro workbook, this workbook, are main choices you have to choose from. And at that moment, what I encourage you to do is to decide about recording the macro and save in this workbook, the one you are working at that moment. But the second option, personal macro workbook, that's a special place where you could store all your macros you want to have accessible always, no matter you are in. I mean, what's the file you are working with? Because if you store the macro in the personal macro workbook, that's the special workbook that will be open always, even if you can't see the workbook because it's hidden. It will be always accessible, and that's why all the macros stored in that workbook will be accessible each time you want to run it. So this is a good idea sometimes to store these macros there. I choose this workbook is because it will be a good idea at that moment to have it in that place, especially that the macro we are going to build will be related to the given content of that workbook. It will be dedicated to what we've got here. And this is the reason I decide to and suggest you to save this macros in this workbook. Okay, so this is the choice we made here. Then you say what the macro is doing and what you intend to do. Finally, of course, all these settings you could change. So no need to think at that moment what will be the description. Maybe it will change in the future. Same with shortcut. You could assign all this stuff later. So at that moment, maybe I'm changing only macro name. I change it to filter, maybe filter 1, because maybe we will record another macro with the filter 2 and maybe filter 3 and others. So I will call it filter 1. What is important here, it's not allowed here to use some special chars, and these special characters are space. So you can have spaces in between the parts of the name. And you can't use the dots, hash characters, and other special chars, because finally, of course, if you've got some characters that are not allowed, so we will be informed. But if you set all this stuff, at that moment it's only name, and this workbook has the macro location. When you click OK, so Excel starts recording. You should know that no matter what you do here, you could click the cell, everything will be recorded. So every single click, every operation like scrolling the sheet, like writing data into the cell, so everything will be recorded. And finally, it will be harder for you then to recognize the content of the macro. So usually if you're interested on what the macro recorded for you, it will be better for you to record only a single operation or maybe 2 only in order to recognize that stuff and edit. That's why it's really helpful for you if you start recording by just recording the operation you want to do. So for us, the operation we want to do is apply the autofilter. That's why I'm going to the data tab where we've got the autofilter tool, and I'm clicking that autofilter tool. So I click it. At that moment, I apply the autofilter, right? You can see by the icons I've got at the top, at the header row of my data range. And at that moment, I'm clicking one of these columns in order to apply filtering criteria. So it's quite easy. For example, now I'm clicking the second column header, the arrowing me to just apply the autofilter, and maybe I choose by these checkboxes here, for example, only the given region. So I'm clicking East, and at that moment I can see, yeah, the table was filtered. So at that moment, after applying the autofilter and filtering criteria to the second column, I should remember to stop recording, because if I forget to stop recording, of course, the tool is still recording all these steps. This is why I'm going back to the status bar, where the button changed its shape. Now it looks like the square, the gray square. So I'm clicking this gray square at the status bar, and I stop recording the macro. This is a very important step, right? If you forget, sometimes you will lead to the exit crash, and you will be confused about what happened. So this is why it's so important to stop the macro, right? When you start recording, remember to stop it. All right, so now we are ready to see what was recorded, because as I said, usually when you want to record the macro and then reuse it, of course it's not a problem, but the problem is if you want this macro working more general, because usually, as I understand, I could work with this kind of table, but in many different months, maybe different years, and at the same time, of course, it means I work with different workbooks, maybe different sheets, but everywhere I want to just rerun the macro so that it applies this filtering for me. Of course, that criteria was very easy to apply, and when we think about automating that stuff, so maybe it looks quite stupid, but of course, it's easy, right, to imagine how to apply then another criteria. Like, for example, I could go to sales and apply the greater than criteria, and maybe another column and another one, and go through many columns and apply filtering criteria that are quite complex and takes time to complete. So maybe at that moment I applied only two criteria. First, I recorded only one, right? So another one we record maybe applying to sales. But maybe first, let's go to see what was recorded. And to do that, you could go once again by the View tab. And there is a button macros, right? This time I'm clicking the upper part of the button, or when you click it, so you can get the list of all these macros you've gotten access by Excel. So for example, here on the list I see on the screen, I've got two different workbooks that are accessible at that moment. The one is a personal macro workbook. For me, I've got there only one file, but I don't want to see the content of that. And to do that, I can use the filter below, allowing me to see only the macros of the given workbook. By default, it's all open workbooks, but if I want to see only the one I'm working with, this workbook, so I can apply this filtering criteria, and I can see, yeah, there is only one, the one we recorded. So at that moment, I'm clicking the macro I want to edit and see the code. And on the right side, I've got the button edit. So after clicking, I can get the view of that macro. But at that moment, what is open is a completely different tool. It's not the part of Excel application. This is the tool that is called Visual Basic Editor. And that tool is accessible by the Office package. It means installing Office package, you've gotten access to the Visual Basic Editor as well, because it's installed by default. And that's completely different tool. We can see them by menus because they look old style, right? We can have them by drop-down list. That's the menu. Of course, there is a toolbar as well, but it's not looking like on the ribbon, right? And in general, this tool, the view, got maybe just close the window. Usually that is not open. It's open for me only because I did it. But usually, what you see, what you see is the view split into 3 different panes. So the left pane showing you all the files that are open with its so-called projects, Visual Basic projects. And bottom part, you've got the properties window. And on the right side, you've got the code window presenting to you the code of the macros. You could have here more macros, not only one, but more. At that moment, it's only one because we recorded only one macro in that document. And it starts from the blue text. At that moment, it's important to focus on colors here because here by color you can recognize what is the given part of the code and what's the meaning of that code. By the way, I'm deleting the elements that is not the case for you. That's something added automatically for me because of the settings I've made to my document. At that moment, it's not important for you, so that's why I'm deleting, so that we can see exactly the same content, okay? Exactly the same content. And what you see here, you've got in 3 different colors. The first we can see is the blue one. And what is blue is a sub word and sub. And this is very important to understand that these are Visual Basic keywords. Because if you want to record macros and then edit them, you should know that the code written here, they uses Visual Basic language code. Not much, but some of these words of the Visual Basic programming language stuff will be visible here. And sub, these are words of the Visual Basic. They are not so important, but of course, they mark the beginning and the end of the macro. Because we could have many macros in that place. So this is the reason we could have some elements pointing what is the starting and what is the ending element of that macro. And sub, as you see, starts the macro, and after we've got the name, the one we just wrote at that window when we click start recording. So that's the name. And finally, the next group of lines you see are green. These are comments. And the comments are always started with the apostrophe character. Apostrophe characters starts the comment. And comment is nothing special, right? This is something you write to just describe what's happening here. And you could always use them to describe the elements of the code. Finally, of course, they do nothing. And no automation is standing after the comments. This is only a comment. So that's why, for example, if you want to describe the macro here, why not to do that? So you can use these lines to say, the macro is filtering, and you could write the full comment telling what the macro is exactly filtering, what the macro is extracting from your data. So this is quite easy to use these comments. And even if they are doing nothing, they're really important for you. Because when you write the description and you then finally come back to that code, let's say after 1 month, you don't have to translate the code meaning to what the macro is doing. You just read the comments, right? So one time you just understand, you just describe, and finally it will be easier for you to just remind about what the macro is doing. That's why it's quite important. Of course, if you don't like all these lines commented, so you can delete them, right? That's the editor. That's the editor. So all that stuff you've got here, you could edit, and that's what we can do. And this is what we are going to do here. And then another part of your code is black. So all that stuff that that play the role of automation in Excel, it's in general in black. If it's in red, it means there is a syntax error, because all that stuff you write here must be following rules, very important rules that are, of course, at that moment not known for you, but these rules are very, very important. And if you forget about some rules, for example, if you omit the quotation mark, or maybe closing parentheses, for example, so you will see that your code will start to be in red. So, for example, at that moment, I deleted the quotation mark, the closing quotation mark for that part of code, and it becomes red. What means something is wrong here. So be careful. Sometimes even by mistake, you could just delete something, and maybe it occurs it's not following the rules that are obligatory here. All right, but what's happening here, right? What's happening here, and why we should edit that code? Why we should edit that code? Because we've got two operations here. That one here, and another one at that place. Every single line usually is a single statement doing something in Excel. It's not a rule always, but in general it is. So for example, here I've got something that is looking like selection, then autofilter. Of course, I can guess, yeah, we did two operations. The first was applying the autofilter, turning it on, and then another one was applying the criteria to the column region. So that's what the second operation, and it looks like, yeah, that's the first one to turn it on, and the second here is to apply the filtering criteria. Easy to guess, because knowing English, we can easily guess what's happening here, right? So to the selection, I don't know what's selected. It was one cell only. So according to that selection, we applied the autofilter. What I remember, one of these cells selected was inside the table. That was sufficient to turn the autofilter on. And then in context of that selection, we just turned it on. Just click autofilter. The second thing was applying the autofilter, and I see active sheet. Yeah, it was on active sheet, the one we were in. And then after a dot, so once again, same, look, here we've got once the same thing, a dot. So it looks like we just compose the operation from different parts, and the first part is defining something we want to do something with, like active sheet. Then in that active sheet, what we define is a range of cells of that active sheet. Looks like, right? It's easy to guess, because we've got the range keyword, the range word, and inside the parentheses, we've got the something that looks exactly like the address of the range. Easy to guess, right? And then on that range, what we do after a dot, we apply autofilter. So looks easy, that rule. We've got dots, but each time we've got the dot, it means with that thing do, and we do that thing. So with the active sheet, we extract the given range of data, right, from that place, and then we apply the autofilter to it. But at that moment, it looks like the autofilter got argument, like function got. And by these arguments, we said about what are these criteria I want to apply. And it looks at that moment quite simple. Field 2, maybe it's a mystery here. What means 2? But if you remind about what was the column number we applied the criteria, so that was the second column of that range. So yeah, the meaning of that argument that is called here field is 2, what means that, yeah, it is referring the column number 2 of that range here. Easy to guess. And then we've got the criteria, that means east. As you see, it's enclosed in quotation marks. So here in code, quotation marks means literals. Literals means usually the string of characters, and it's always here in the code enclosed in quotation marks. And here what we can see is the criteria 1 argument is set to east. Of course, we can change it at that moment. So for example, if I want to apply the filtering criteria to choose maybe west, not east. So the only thing to change here is to change that text. Same thing will be with that range. It means that if you want to apply your filtering criteria to the bigger area, because your table now is bigger, so you could change that range here, but it's not effective, right? I mean, it's rather stupid idea. What's that automation that each time I should change that part here, right? I want to create a macro that will automate my work, and not each time I should go to that code and change it in order to fit exactly the size of my data. So it takes time. So we've got the same result, right? No matter what's that operation, we apply the filtering going by these columns step by step, or we go here and change all that stuff here. Yeah, I agree. So this is why what I said, usually to make it more flexible, so that it applies to all that data we've got on the sheet. So we have to change the code a little bit to make it working better, and always general. So I just show you some tips to make it. But before we start, once again, I want to now record the macro showing you how to apply then the criteria to another column. So now we record another macro, and this time we apply the criteria to two columns, right? So that, for example, it is applied to the column number 2, I mean the region, and then to the column number, I don't know, it's 7, yeah, the sales, maybe looks like 7. Yeah, the column number 7, exactly. So let's do that. Once again, to remind how to record the macro, maybe I just turned it off. I'm using here the shortcut like Ctrl-Shift-L to turn it off. And once again, I click the button, maybe just call it filter 2. And I click OK. Once again, I'm recording macro and store it in this workbook. Still, it's not saved, but the document is not saved. That's the separate discussion about saving workbooks with macros. It's a very important discussion, so this is the reason I wanted you to save this in this workbook. It's very important, so that's why we should do that. Okay, so I click OK. Now I apply filtering criteria. This time, once again, I'm going to data. Of course, if you know shortcuts, like I do, I click Ctrl-Shift-L to apply filtering criteria. Exactly, to apply autofilter. And then I'm applying filtering criteria. So let's say this time we choose not east, but maybe west. And after choosing west, I'm applying at the same time the sales criteria. I want to choose the values that are greater than, let's say, 10,000. So I'm choosing number filtering, and then greater than, and choose 10,000. And stop recording. And stop recording, don't forget. So click stop. And after, I'm going back to that code. At that moment, maybe, if you want to continue your story with programming Excel, automating Excel, so it will be easier for you to switch in between Excel and this editor, Visual Basic Editor, by using shortcut. So it could be Alt Tab, like usually, if you've got only 2 applications open, it will be quite fast. But if you've got many applications open, operating system was usually the case. So what I encourage you to do is to use the shortcut like left Alt and F11. This is a switch in between only this editor and the application Excel. So it will be faster for you to switch in between your code and of the macro and the content of the worksheet. So maybe just write it here as a command. So left Alt button plus functional F11 key allows you to switch in between. That's the switch in between Excel and VBA. Exactly, that's the VBE shortcut. That's the Visual Basic Editor. That's the name, and that's the short from it. Maybe just write it next. So that's the Visual Editor. This is short from that name. Be careful about the functional keys if you work with laptops, because this button could be accessible by sometimes. It's the second function of the button, not the first one. So if you've got such a case with your keyboard, so access to the F11 you should have with the FN button. So you have to check it. All right, so that's how you can fast switch in between these two places. And look, at that moment in our code, we've got two macros. This is what I said, that yeah, we could have many macros here, and these macros you could then edit in that place easy way, because this is editor like the Notepad or maybe Word. So every content here could be edited and changed. Still we've got in our code the reference to the constant range. It means it's still constant, but in a moment I'll show you how to make it always automatically fitted to the whole content of your table. So first of all, I want to focus on what is that content we have here, because at that moment we see that the autofilter was called here 2 times. So we've got now the first line turning on the autofilter, the second line, the one that chooses the west region, but the next line looks like it's splitted, but the next line is the one where we apply the criteria greater than 10,000. But look that it is the repetition of that statement we've got above. The only difference is the definition of that criteria. That's the only difference in between these two lines. So it looks like if you want to apply the criteria to many different columns, the only thing to do is to just repeat the same statement and only change the criteria and the column number you want to apply this criteria. Here you've got another element, the one here, operator, and it looks like it's completely separate statement, but it's not. What you see here at the end, the underscore character, here in the code means the continuation character. And if some statements are long, you could split them to many lines. And this is something really useful, because when you just scroll the window to see the code, and you've got many different macros here, so usually it's not a comfortable way to see them by scrolling using the horizontal scroll bar to see all the whole content of the statement. So this is why usually in that code of the macro, in the code of the macro, the underscore characters is used to split long statement into many lines. So each time you see underscore, it means, yeah, another part of the statement was split, just moved to another line of code. So that was an operator argument, as you see, similar to what we have in the first criteria statement. Here we've got something extra, the argument that is called operator. Here it's not useful. I mean, it's not used, in fact, it's listed, but it's completely useless here. That's the problem with macro recorder. Usually it records much more than it's needed to get the results. For example, from my experience, I know that this is completely useless here and we could delete. This is because what you should know, when you apply the filtering criteria, you could apply up to 2 different criteria. So it means there is another argument that is called criteria 2, and with criteria 2 could be set with the operator argument XL AND or XL OR. It would mean that you could combine 2 different criteria with the logical OR or logical AND operator. Of course, you can record the macro. So for example, if I wanted to have here the criteria that is the range criteria, like I want to have all these sales in between 10,000 and 20. So this operator AND will be helpful for us, but at the same time, another criteria 2 argument will be set. Well, you can, of course, experiment just by recording that such a criteria. But at that moment, I don't care about this operator, so that's why I'm just deleting what I said. This is an editor I can delete, so this is what I'm doing. I'm deleting that argument. So same was with this underscore character and the comma car at the end. So leaving only that statement here. So now I think about automating this so that we don't have to each time change the code and the range that is related to that operation of filtering, especially that we know we could have many different rows. Each time it could be different, right? We open it for the next month or maybe the next year, and we will have bigger table usually. So how to change that macro to make it more general, right? So so that we can just click one of these cells of the table, and Excel automatically will do that for us. So now I will show you that you don't have to record macros. If you know some, if you've got some knowledge about another macros you recorded, you could guess something, do some experiment, do some checkings, because you know the programming is always a challenge and experimenting. So that's why, yeah, what I'm going to do now, I'm just doing a copy of the macro. I'm not going to record. I'm doing a copy of the macro, the previous one. Of course, we can't have here the macros of the same name. That's why I'm changing the name to filter 3. So be careful. The macros can't have the same names in the module. And now, after changing the name of the macro, maybe I just remove the comments that are not needed for me at that moment. And I decide to change the whole part of the reference we have to active sheet and to that range of data. And I'm changing it to another reference that is possible here. Sometimes you could record that reference, but at that moment I just show you. That's the reference to the cell that is selected. So it could be, for example, active cell. So instead of the reference to active sheets to given range, you could always replace it with the active cell reference. This is what is possible. And what's more, you even don't need to turn the autofilter on separately. It means that if you turn it with the criteria as well, that's the only thing to do to apply the autofilter criteria and the autofilter itself. So that's why I decided to delete that line, so that we've got only 2 lines to apply the autofilter. So only 2. The active cell autofilter field 2 criteria west, and active cell autofilter field 7 criteria 1 greater than 10,000. And that's sufficient to make our macro working more general, because at that moment the autofilter will start from active cell, and automatically it will just get that range related to that active cell. So all the data stuff you've got there. Of course, it's limited. If you've got some empty rows in the table, so unfortunately it will work. But usually it's not the case. Usually we've got the data in a continuous way with no empty rows, empty columns. And of course, I'm telling about the whole empty row and the whole empty column. So this is the case where you will find it's not working correctly. So this is something very important and good to write. What I assume here, assumption here is no empty rows, columns in the range of data, right? So this is something we have to assume if we are going to refer the active cell. And we assume that the user got the cell inside the table clicked, right? Because that's the active cell we want to refer and turn the autofilter in context of what is selected, maybe, or maybe what is the active cell. So this is why it's very important to remember about this. But having this macro now, we can run it easy way just by a button. I want to show you now how to assign to a button a macro, so that then finally you click the button and run this macro. Let's do that. So I go back to my interface, Excel interface, and now above I've got some place to draw a button, what it could be. So it could be an image you could just download from the internet. It could be one of these shapes you've gotten access to in Excel. So maybe because it will be easier, I'm going to the Insert tab, and there you will find the Shapes button. That's the group Illustrations where you find it. So there is a button Shapes when you click. So you'll find a lot of shapes, no matter which one you choose. Maybe it will be a good idea to choose the one where you could finally then have a text box, so that you can describe the button. For example, I can use the button that looks like a button on the keyboard, right? So I'm just drawing it here. And after I draw this button, I just click and start writing to maybe just call it filter 3. Of course, now I just call it same as the macro. It's not, of course, a must to have it. You write here what you like, no matter what's the name here. But what's important is to then assign a macro to it. So after you edit the content and the text here, you click right mouse button, and with the context menu, you've got here the position assign macro. Really easy to assign the macro to that button. So no matter what, if it's that shape or maybe an image, you can assign a macro to it. Of course, you have to first define this macro, record that macro, maybe write it. But when you click assign macro, so you will see the list of all these macros you recorded, or maybe you just created yourself. So for example, here I've got the macros. The first two was recorded, but the last macro we've got here on the list was created by copying the second one and editing the content of that macro. So I click this filter 3 macro to say that this is the macro I want to assign to the button. And now when you stop editing the button, what you could do with the escape button, or maybe clicking the cell. So finally, now you've got this button working as link. So for example, now when I hover that shape, I can see an icon that's the palm, and this is what tells me, that's the link. Yeah, it is a link, but this is a link to the macro. At that moment, to see how it works, I'm just turning off the autofilter to see the whole table content, right? So now I just clear the filter, and I click one of these cells inside, because once again, the macro starts with the active cell. So in order to make it running properly, the active cell should be the one inside the table, right? Otherwise it won't work correctly. But now I click one of these cells inside, and I click the macro to see, oh man, it works. So all that table is filtered. And at that moment, I see more complex situations. So at that moment, we've got only 2 columns where we apply the filtering criteria, but it's easy then, right, to define the filtering criteria to many different columns, and finally to run these macros with such a one button click. As you see, it wasn't really complex, right? The only thing we did as a trick, a simple trick, was change the code that we've got just next to the autofilter reference, right? So here is the autofilter reference, and we changed the content we've got next to active cell, because as I said, the problem with the one here is that it's always referring that part of a data listed here as a constant text value. And here it is V4J32. So if my range will be extended and I added, for example, new 100 of rows, they won't be included in the macro filtering results. So this is the problem usually. So if you don't want to go back here and always change the range, so the solution is to change what was recorded to the active cell reference. Of course, finally, what you should remember is to always first start from clicking one of these cells you've got in the table. What's more, it could work not only for that table and in that document. Finally, you could make this macro working globally for all these workbooks where you filter the same type of a table. So for example, usually we work with the same table with different data, right? The data that is related to that year or maybe that month. And each time it's the same table, but for different period or maybe different country or maybe different category in general. But still the same table. And in general, we want to apply same filtering criteria. So how to make this automation working globally? Because it will be really helpful then for us, no matter what is the document we work with, we could just click and run it. So this is what's very important because usually when we want to create automation, we want to make it working globally. I mean, for all documents we are working with. So that's the next step I want to show you here. That's the next step I want to show you here. But first of all, to summarize what happened here and to save our work, first of all, I show you once again the pane on the left side where we've got the document we work with and the project related to it. So what you should know, all that content here you see on the left in the project pane, in the project window, that's not only the file you are working with, but at the same time, the workbook that is called personal. You can see here even personal and the extension XLSB. That's the file called personal macro workbook. I've got this here. Most probably you haven't, but in a moment I show you how to create such a document. And what you have here at the same time, these are Excel add-ins that are installed and active. So for example, here I've got an add-in called Toolbox that is present here. Of course, once again, it's not the case for you, right? Because you haven't such a add-in. But what is important for us? Of course, we search here for the file we work with and where we store the macros. That's why I clicked that plus button next to that project. So this is a project related to the book one, the file that was created as a new document. And now when I just expand this project, I can see two folders. So Microsoft Excel Objects folder and the second modules folder. The second one at that moment is the most important for us because the modules folder contains so-called modules, and these modules contains your macros. So when you expand the folder, you can see at that moment one module. But in the future, when you record more macros in that document, so you will find that macro recorder will be creating new modules, module 2, module 3, and so on. And it's quite a good idea. If you imagine you've got 100 or maybe 200 different macros, it's really a good idea to split them in between different modules. So that's a logical split. I mean, you decide about how to divide them into many different groups so that you finally will scroll to them easier way, or maybe to find them easier way. These modules could be named. So for example, if I select the if I select the given module, so below in the properties window, I can change this name for that module. For example, I could write it as RC or maybe source. Doesn't matter what will be that name, but it will be a good idea to name it, because finally it will be easier for us to recognize what's in. So for example, I'm just calling SRC maybe at that moment as a short from source. Yeah, so let's imagine you prepare some tools and you want to move them so that you can use them anywhere. Because what you should remember, the macros we've got recorded are recorded in the project related to our document. And if the document is closed, you've got no access to these macros. And this is a problem usually, right? You want to run this macro, but it's not accessible because the file is closed. And at that moment, first of all, we just save the file, because it's really very important for that situation, especially that for the sake of security, the Excel application differentiates in between Excel files that contains macros and the one that it's not with the macro. And this is the reason we should now discuss this topic. So now, if you want to save the document, let's say you want to save it, let's choose the place you want to. Maybe for me it will be the desktop, and I want to save it. Maybe let's say it will be webinar. And now, after I click enter to save, I can read that the following features cannot be saved in macro-free workbook. Macro-free workbook, this is what I read with that message. And I read that a Visual Basic project, VB project, cannot be saved with macro-free workbook. Yeah, this is because when you recorded macro, if you want to store the content of these macros, you have to do that by saving this document as macro-enabled workbook. You can't save it as normal workbook. And this is the reason, be careful here, because to continue saving as macro-free workbook, click yes. So for us, we should click no, because I don't want to save this document as macro-free workbook. If I do that, finally, I will lose all that work. I mean, the macros will be deleted. So you have to click no, and then from the Save as Type dialog window, you have to choose the second position, Excel macro enabled workbook. So that's the file type you have to choose from. So I click that file type, and now when I save it, looks okay. Looks okay. All right, so at that moment, maybe I just close the file for a while, and I will reopen it to show you that what happens if you open the files with macros. It's really very important to see. And I'm closing, searching for that file on desktop. Yeah, it is. That's the file we saved. By the way, look what's the icon, how it's looking. So we've got here an extra element in comparison to normal Excel file. So the Excel file containing macros, they contain a special element like the exclamation character, what tells you, yeah, this is the file containing macros. What you should know about macros: the macros could run automatically when you start the file. When you open the file, the macro could run. And this is why it's so important to know about this, because the macros could run malicious code as well, not only the one automating Excel. So this is why it's so important. And usually when you open the files with macros, you are informed about this. So Excel tells you with the security warning at the top that the macros have been disabled. So they are not active, you can't run them. If you want to run them, if you want to use them, you have to agree to that by clicking Enable Content. This is very important to know about this, because if you forget to click it, of course, that element here disappears. And if you want to click then this button to run the macro, you will see the message like, cannot run the macro may not be available in this workbook, or macros may be disabled. So that's why you have to remember, from that moment you work with Excel files containing macros, macro-enabled workbooks. So you will be always informed with such a message, and you have to agree to run macros to use them. Of course, it depends on security settings as well. So it means if you are able to change them, because maybe the company policy are so that you cannot. But if you can, so yeah, you could agree to all macros without this notification, right, on the yellow tab. So depends on what's the situation. But of course, otherwise, if you've got no choice, you have to remember this message will be always visible when you open the files containing macros. By the way, the macro files have got not only the icon different, but at the same time the extension is different. Normal files, normal Excel files, they've got the extension XLSX, and the macro files contains this extension like XLSM. This is the difference in between them. So easy to recognize if you can see by your file manager the extensions of your files. Okay, so now I'm going back to Visual Basic Editor because, for example, at that moment I want to just move these macros we recorded, especially the second one. I want to move to the personal macro workbook. Most probably you've got no such a personal macro workbook. So in a moment I show you how to create such a book. And finally, I show you how to move then the macros from another project to the project related to personal macro workbook. So finally, we can run our macros just clicking the button on the ribbon. So we can make our macro running globally. Okay, so how to do that, right? So how to do that? Now we have to create the personal macro workbook. Maybe you've got this personal macro workbook, but if not, I show you it's quite easy to just create this file by recording the macro. So I'm clicking once again the button that will run the macro recorder, but this time from the Store Macro In dropdown, I'm choosing personal macro workbook. So it's so easy. You just record the macro pointing that you want to store the macro in personal macro workbook. That's so simple. So I'm choosing. Now I click. And what could be that macro? Maybe you ask yourself, what should be that macro? Doesn't matter. Just click the cell and that's it. And stop recording. So it's sufficient to just click one simple cell, and of course that operation will be recorded. And finally, if you stop, so a personal macro workbook will be created, and you will see that the code will appear in that personal macro workbook. So I'm opening it now. I'm opening the Visual Basic Editor. Now I'm expanding the project related to the personal. Same you should see at that moment. So it means when you open that Visual Basic Editor, to remind, you could use the shortcut left alt and F11 to switch easier way in between these two apps. And now you should see here on the list of the projects, you have to see the project related to the file personal. Hope it is. And now I'm opening the modules folder. Modules folder, for me, it has two modules. Maybe just delete the old one. I don't need that, so I'm just removing it. As you see, it's easy, just right mouse button and you've got here remove. What you could do that always. And I'm asked here what to do if I want to just save the content or not. Of course, I disagree. I don't want to save. That's the temporary content there. And I've got here the module. When I click a double to see the content, by the way, I'm not sure I told you. So to get the content of that module, just double click or maybe right mouse button, view code. So the easiest is to double click. So I click double and I see the macro that was recorded. As you see, clicking the cell is quite easy statement. It's just range, the address of that cell in quotation marks, and then select. So that's the statement that was recorded when we selected one single cell on the sheet, on the active sheet. Of course, as it was in the previous examples, you could edit everything here. That's the editor. And I decided to delete all that content because I don't want to have these macros here. But in place of that macro recorded, I want to just have here the macro we prepared in our previous document, the document called webinar. As you see, even here, we can see the webinar XLSM, that's the workbook name, and the extension is XLSM, right? That's the extension of the file. So I'm going to the module SRC, the one we created in that file. And now I copy only that macro, only the one here. Of course, this is text, so I'm copying, right? I'm copying to the clipboard like a text. And I'm moving back to the module 1. So once again, I double click it. And I paste the content of that macro here. Maybe it would be a good idea to change the name in that place. Maybe filter west, and it could be filter west. Okay, let's change the name to filter west. Doesn't matter what's that name, but of course, good to name it so that you can recognize by name of the macro what the macro is doing, right? It's always a good idea to name it. By the way, you could have here in the name up to 255 cars, so it's quite a big name. But better ways to add description, right? Like a comment. Good to have a description of the macro here. So remember that always you can add description of the macro as comment, starting with apostrophe. You could add that comment easy way. So even if the macro name is rather not readable for you, you can add the description easy way. All right, so now we are ready to assign to this macro here, a button we could have on the ribbon. Having this on the ribbon, we've gotten access to this interface no matter what is the file we work with, right? So you could create new one, you could open existing one, and always on the ribbon, you've got such a button. So now I want to show you how to add such a button and then link this button to the macro you've got in the personal macro workbook. So you will find that it will be finally a good idea to add such a button and to use it in all these tables having the same structure. Remember that this macro should have, we assume that the table we work with has the same structure. So the columns are on the same positions usually, but the content is different, right? Means that we've got it for different, let's say, months, or maybe different countries, or maybe for different peer products, right? Doesn't matter. But the structure is the same. All these columns are always on its positions as usually, because even when we go and see the code, we can state, yeah, the field argument is always referring the given column by number. So if I want to apply the criteria like West to the column number 2, so I should know the column number 2 contains regions, and the column number 7 should contain sales always. Otherwise, the filter doesn't make sense, right? So this is what we should know about. But assuming it is the case, so we can use such a macro in order to just keep our auto-filter settings and then use them in any document where we've got the same structure of data, right? And this is what I'll show you. All right, so let's assign this macro to the button and have this button on the ribbon. Quite easy, really. If you want to do that, go to the File menu. So you go to the File, and on the left where you got the green tab, So go to the button options. So you go to Excel options at that moment. And when you click it, so you will have on the screen the Excel options dialog window. On the left, in the menu, you choose the customize ribbon. When you choose it, you will see on the right 2 different lists. The second on the right is the one where you've got the information about different tabs you've got in the ribbon. By the way, you could change what is visible. So for example, if I don't want to play with the page layout tab, so I can just uncheck it. You can change even the order of these tabs. But at the same time, you could add new tab. So if I imagine I want to have more macros to run them, I could create new tab, completely new tab. So I click the button below, new tab, to have it. By the way, it's always added after the selected one. So here I've got selected page layout. This is why it appeared after page layout. Of course, not a must to have it here. When you select with those arrows on the right, you could decide what's that position, right? So maybe you just put it at the end. I just put it at the end. And of course, you could change the name for it, because the name you see here, like a new tab, it's not a good one for us. So that's why I'm adding here, by clicking right mouse button, I choose from the context menu rename, and I change it to my macros, maybe my macros. Yeah. And what you should know in general, it's I hope that all these buttons we've got on the ribbon are grouped. Of course, usually they are grouped by topic. So for example, all these settings and buttons related to fonts are grouped in a group called font. So as you see here, by default, we've got already the group inside our tab. Once again, the name is new group, so tell us nothing, but of course we could change it, right? You could click right mouse button, choose from the drop down rename, and you decide about what will be the name of that group. Let's say it will be extra tools, click OK. And now you are ready to add to your new tab and to that group extra tools new buttons. So to do that, on the left side, on the left list, you have to choose the macros. But before you choose the macros, you have to use in the upper drop-down list, you have to choose the filter. So I'm clicking the drop-down above. I choose the macros position from there. And now I've gotten access to all these macros that are accessible from all these add-ins, open documents. But of course, we search for personal macro workbook. So it will be easy to find it, because it will be always started with a file name, personal. So when I scroll, I can see that some of these will be started with, for us, it will be only one, because I've got only one macro inside this document. So it is here, you see, personal XLSB, that's the personal macro workbook. And we've got there the macro called filter west. And now I make sure I've got selected extra tools tab, right? Exactly here. Exactly, it is a group. So I've got this selected. Now I'm going to the left list and select the macro I want to add to this group. And I click the button add that we have in between these two lists. So that's how we just move, exactly copy that macro to our new group. And at that moment, you should know that you could change the name. So once again, I'm renaming what is here. I remove the personal XLSB, and I just leave the name like filter west. At that moment, of course, I could have spaces here. And if you like, you could use the icon. So it means you will see such an icon on the ribbon, right? So no matter what it will be, let's use the smile icon here, no matter what's that, of course. So when you use the icon, it will be appearing as the icon of the button. So I click OK. And now when you click OK, you have to see as the final step that new tab was added automatically to your ribbon, and there you will find the extra tools group, and inside this group you've got one button called Filter West. Of course, it will work, once again, it will work in any document. So here, yes, it will work. So maybe just clear the filter and click the button, click one of these cells inside, and I click the button I have on the ribbon. Oh man, it works. Hell yeah. Let's check if it works for another document. Of course, we should have, once again, the data there. So let's imagine I've got here the document that contains bigger part of this data. So I want to open it first. All right, so that's the table I get the data from. It's bigger, much bigger than the one I presented to you. So I expect that when I go now to my tab, my macros, as you see, this tab is always visible. So it's not locally defined. It means that no matter what is the document we work with, this macros, my macros tab will be always visible. This is the case here. And at that moment, I can run the macro and filter this table, even if it's much bigger and completely placed different document and different place. Doesn't matter. As I understand, this table is exactly the same structure. I mean, the second column is region, the seventh column is sales. So the structure is the same. The number of rows is different, but it doesn't matter. Because of the autofilter, automatically, starting from the active cell, the one we are referring by the macro, automatically extend that area to the whole content of the table. Of course, what is important is to remember that if you've got the whole empty rows in the table, it won't work. It will filter only that part. So be careful. The automation will work always to data that is continuous with no empty rows, empty columns. This is important to remember about this. But because here's continuous table, that's why I'm clicking Filter West, and I got it. So all my data here is referring to West, and it's referred to the sales greater than 10,000. So look how easy it is. Now just record the macro where you apply complex filtering criteria, and finally you can rerun it easy way by clicking a button. So even here, look, if I've got big table and I need to choose many different elements from the list, let's say hundreds from thousands, so it will take time to select them all. But if you do that one time, finally recording the macro, so finally applying the filter will be very easy. Just click a button. Even here, I will try to do that once again. I click the macro recorder. Maybe just this time, once again, I save this macro to personal macro workbook, and I decide to record the macro applying multiple choice criteria to the column product. So let's say I choose that one from here and that one from here, and then maybe this one and then this one. So yeah, usually multiple choice, especially if you choose many elements, takes time, right? Especially if we've got no rules to search, because the names are completely different. So we have no choice, and we have to search for them somehow step by step and select them separately. So it could be really annoying and time consuming. That's why if it's possible to record and then reuse it, it will be really big help for us. That's why I'm clicking OK. Now stop recording, because to remind, we started macro recorders, so now we have to stop it first. And after clicking stop, I go back to Visual Basic Editor to see the content. Of course, because we recorded to the personal macro workbook, it's the second macro here. And maybe I call this macro filter multiple choice. Multiple choice, just to emphasize that this is exactly what was recorded. And once again, I see, same thing here. We've got active sheet range, and the range is limited only to the given area. We know what to do now. The only thing to do is to change it to active cell. So I'm changing active cell, same as it was above. And I see that this time looks a little bit different, that because at that moment, the autofilter criteria one argument, it's defined completely different in comparison to the previous one. In the previous example, it was quite clear to, for us is that a criteria. Because it was used with greater than, maybe less than, it was easy to guess what to do to make it different. But at that moment, it's something that looks like a function with the list of different values. Of course, easy to guess, right? That's the list, and most probably we can edit that list. Exactly. So it means that even here, if you know that the list changed, you could just one by one change the values here, or maybe add new elements, delete the existing one. Yeah, it's possible. This time, operator argument, it's a must to have it, because the operator value is Excel filter values. It's very important because it's telling the autofilter that the filtering criteria are defined by the list of values. So this is important to know about this. It's impossible to delete. If you delete that argument now, the operator, unfortunately, it won't work for you. So that's why it's so important to have it at that moment, because last time we deleted, so it's not always possible. And this is the case. At that moment, you should leave the argument operator because it's important here. Okay, so we change it. Now we are able to assign the button to that macro. So once again, maybe I'm going back to File, Excel options, Customize ribbon. And of course, I'm going to now change the content of our extra tools group. That's why I'm selecting this group first. And then I'm choosing once again the list of macros, search for the personal macro workbook here, and I choose the second macro there. As you see, it appeared here automatically. So Excel recognizes we change the content of the personal macro workbook. It's automatically included on the list. I'm selecting, clicking add button in between, and maybe once again I'm changing the name and the icon representing the button. So I just call it multiple choice, and the icon, what it could be. Maybe this time something, maybe many dots. Okay, so click OK. Once again, and now we've got two buttons. As you see, now we've got two buttons, the one representing the first filtering criteria, and the second, the one related to the product column, applying multiple choice criteria. Let's check if it's working for us. So I'm maybe first of all clearing the filtering criteria here, and once again clicking the button on our My Macros tab, this time the multiple choice button. And it is. When I go to check if these are exactly those elements I checked, I go through the list and I see, exactly. These elements I selected are selected exactly like it was recorded in our macro. So look how much time you could save now having such a button, or maybe buttons, applying for you your criteria, especially if the criteria are quite complex and usually the same, because otherwise if they are still changing, so finally this automation is not so helpful. But at the same time, even in this example, in this situation, you could automate that stuff. So for example, you could read the information about what are the filtering criteria from cells. It's possible. It's possible to read the information from cells and make them filtering criteria. So it is possible, but of course, this is something you could do, knowing more about Visual Basic programming language and more about the application Excel. So it's something that is possible, but at the same time, you need more knowledge about this. What I encourage you, of course, to do, because it's always worth to do that, right? If something is then working for you, saving your time, it's worth to do that, I think. So if you've got some questions to what we did here, so you could write to Q&A place. I will try to answer then, not now, but I will answer, and it will be published by my company. But hope it was helpful for you. Hope it was helpful for you, and at the same time, I encourage you to experiment. Really, if you try some examples, do some macros, and try to do some experiments, you can learn a lot. At the same time, maybe I show you that you could find in Microsoft documentation more about using, for example, Autofilter, because the context help is working here. So, for example, if you want to read more about the Autofilter, or maybe the active cell, or maybe other stuff you've got here, so the only thing to do is to click F1 and click the given element in the code and click F1. If you click F1, so in that moment, the Visual Basic editor is linking you to the online documentation. So, for example, now I'm on the web page of the Microsoft documentary, and I can see I click next to the active cell. So I can read more about the active cell, and of course here I've got some examples. So here you could learn more about how to automate Excel. So good to do that, especially that you will find here many examples showing you some tricks, some automation tips as well, and they are described. So for example, here I've got the description. This example changes the font formatting for the active cell. So even here I can copy and paste to my macro in order to change it. And then I experiment with these values here. So it's really helpful to go to the documentation because it's working easy way for us. Just F1, click F1 next to the content you want to read more about, like Autofilter, active cell, and other stuff here. So it will be helpful for you. But of course, if you feel that's for you, so I encourage you to come back, because I just lead here in Comarch the automation lessons, the Excel automation as well, of course, the PowerPoint automation, because you could automate an application, not only Office applications. Everything you could automate in operating system if you like, knowing programming language and some, of course, rules how to do that. So if you like this lesson, so go back and you will find more about automating Excel and other applications as well. But of course, it's a long way. I mean, it's not like one weekend work. It's impossible. You have to practice. Like, for example, when you want to learn how to play tennis, ski, you know that by watching how another people are doing this, it's impossible to learn. You have to experiment. So I hope after this lesson, you could experiment a lot with the Autofilter and other tools of Excel as well. So try to do that, because you can discover a lot of automation that is possible just by recording the macro and a little changing the code. Without experiments, you won't learn how to do that. But at that moment, you've got tools and you know how to do that. Hope it will help you in your work. So yeah, it's a good moment to say it's enough for today, and wish you luck in Excel automation, and yeah, save you time in work by automating Excel. That will be a good idea for you. especially nowadays, where we've got our work endless, and all that stuff is, all our work is overloaded with data and analysis of that data. So hope this helped you. So maybe see you in the future. So bye. Hi.